So now we'll talk about the three different groups that the bilaterians evolved into. Okay, the Lophotrochozoans, Ecdysozoans, and the Deuterostomes. Okay, we've already discussed how bilaterians are the most diverse group of animals. Most of these bilaterians are invertebrates, and therefore invertebrate bilaterians make up about 95% of all the described animal species. They are very diverse morphologically. That means they have all different body types and body shapes, and they occupy almost every habitat on Earth. Okay, there are a few extreme habitats that are only inhabitable by certain types of protists and archaeans, but those are pretty rare. Okay, we find invertebrates just about everywhere. Most invertebrate species belong to Lophotrochozoa and Ecdysozoa. Okay, those are those two clades. A few invertebrates belong to the Deuterostomes, but Deuterostomes is also the clade that includes the chordates, okay, which includes the vertebrates. Here's a picture with some of the interesting diversity in these groups. We have the Lophotrochozoa, which includes quite a few phyla. Some of the examples here of the phyla are Ectoprocta, that's a sessile group of animals, Rotifera, which are microscopic aquatic organisms, and annelids, which are segmented worms. Okay, they're both marine and terrestrial. There are also other groups that are very diverse, like the mollusks are also included in Lophotrochozoa. Ecdysozoa includes organisms that shed an exoskeleton. Okay, this includes the arthropods, which are the most diverse invertebrate group, and the nematodes, the roundworms. The Deuterostomes then have several invertebrate groups, the hemichordates and the echinoderms. Okay, the third phyla that's found in Deuterostomia is not pictured here. It's the chordates, and that's because they include vertebrate species. There are actually more than 1 million arthropod species that have been described, okay, making it about half of all the described species of organisms on Earth. Okay, and way more than half of the number of described species of animals. Okay, so the arthropod diversity is really incredible. So it's pretty important that you remember that arthropods are the most diverse group of animals. Okay, that's a single phylum that contains all this diversity. If we look at just the number of individuals of arthropods on Earth, it's about 1 billion, or 1 billion times 1 billion individuals. That's an awful lot. So members of this phyla are found in nearly all habitats, including the air, many are flying, the soil, many of them live underground, and the water as well. The diversity and success of this group is attributed to its body plan. Okay, the arthropod body plan that's been so successful consists of a segmented body. Many of these arthropods are divided into 3 parts, a head, thorax, and an abdomen. Others have only 2 or a few segments. There's a hard exoskeleton, which is important for protection, and jointed appendages. These allow for lots of very effective movements and some specialized functions. If we look at the history of arthropod evolution, we see that over time there's a decreasing number of body segments, but even while the number of segments has been decreasing, the specialization of the appendages or the extensions that are off of those body segments are more and more specialized. Okay, so we can see this example if we compare a trilobite on the left, that's an extinct arthropod that lived many millions of years ago, and we see how there are a lot of different segments. But most of them are about the same. The first one is a little bit different, but all the other ones are pretty uniform. And the appendages, the pieces sticking off of the sides of the body of the organism, are pretty similar in size and shape as well. We compare this to a modern arthropod, the lobster here, and we see it has only 3 segments: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen is the tail end. But the appendages are very specialized. We've got the pinchers for defense, the antennae that are involved in sensory reception, we've got mouth parts involved in feeding, and separate walking and swimming legs that give the lobster the ability to move around on both the land and the water. Okay, so we can see how this specialization allowed for greater ease of movement in a variety of environments. So we could really say that this lobster is very versatile and pretty darn talented as well. As we look at how these body plans evolved over time, we find that they appear to be regulated by changes in either the DNA sequence or the way that Hox genes are regulated. Okay, this is a particular category of genes that tends to code for different body plans. Okay, and it wasn't necessarily the evolution of different types of Hox genes that led to different body plans, but only slight modifications in those genes, or even modifications in other genes that regulated the expression of Hox genes. Okay, so molecular evidence supports the hypothesis that it was relatively small changes in the DNA sequences that led to big changes in morphology, okay, when it comes to arthropod body plans. So all of the organisms that we've talked about that lived more than 400 million years ago were living in the ocean. Okay, the Cambrian explosion occurred in the ocean, and the invasion of land happened much later. Okay, it happened later in plants and fungi, and then even later in the animals. Next, we're going to discuss the evolution and diversification of the vertebrates. So both the invertebrates that we've talked about before and the vertebrates diversified a great deal in the oceans before entering land. Okay, the Cambrian explosion occurred in the oceans, and for a long time, invertebrates were the dominant predators. Okay, the evolution of vertebrates also stimulated the evolution of new predators. And after they appeared, vertebrates then became the dominant predators, or the most diverse group of predators, and also the largest organisms in the ocean that were the top predators. They were all vertebrates. Vertebrates are named for the vertebrae. Those are the series of cylindrical bones that make up the backbone, and they protect the nervous system of the organism. One of the earliest close relatives of the vertebrates, whose name I won't even try to pronounce, evolved in the ocean during the Cambrian period. Okay, so this is a fossil here. This fish-like organism had some traits that show that it was closely related to the earliest vertebrates. Okay, as we've discussed already, vertebrates are members of the phylum Chordata. Okay, but not all chordates are vertebrates. Okay, let's talk for a moment about some of the traits that chordates share and then talk about how vertebrates are different from other types of chordates. Chordates are bilaterian animals that all belong to the group Deuterostomia. Okay, so they are more closely related to the echinoderms and the other deuterostomes than they are related to the Lophotrochozoans and the ecdysozoans. Okay, this generalized picture here shows some of the features that the chordates share. Okay, now the mouth and the anus, that's representative of the complete digestive tract. And that's a trait shared with other bilaterians that are not chordates. Okay, but the other 4 traits that you see on this diagram are all ones that distinguish the chordates from the other phyla. Okay, so these 4 key characteristics, some of them are present throughout the organism's lifetime, and some of them are present only during embryonic development in some species, but all chordates have each of these 4 characteristics at some point in their life cycle. Okay, so this notochord, that's a flexible rod that provides support. Okay, it tends to be made out of substances like cartilage, which is tough and strong and very protective, but it's also very flexible. Okay, the second characteristic is a dorsal hollow nerve cord. Okay, remember what dorsal means? It means located along the back. Okay, this develops eventually into the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so chordates have a very highly developed central nervous system. Okay, that helps them process sensory information. They also have pharyngeal slits or pharyngeal clefts. Okay, clefts are like an opening. And these function in suspension feeding as gills or as parts of the head. Okay, well, you might be thinking, well, humans are chordates, and where do they have these pharyngeal slits? Or what functions as gills in them? Well, if you look at a picture of an embryo that's very early in its gestational stage, that means it's a baby that's not very close to being born, you can see little gill slits. Okay, that reflects the evolutionary history of humans, and the early embryo is using them as gills. Okay, and then that feature is lost as the baby develops and prepares for breathing air outside of the mother's body. There's also a muscular post-anal tail in all chordates. Okay, so in a human embryo, the early embryo has a tail that shrinks as the baby gets closer to being born. And in adults, that structure is left over in what we call the tailbone. Okay. As we look at the chordates and we try to classify the different groups, the ones that are not vertebrates are the basal group. Okay, the most basal group is called the lancets. It's sort of shaped like a pen or a skinny fish without very well developed fins. Its name lancelet is like a small sword, so that's how this group got its name. And they're sort of a generic chordate. They've got the 4 characteristics, but not a lot of other complex features. And then the tunicates were a group that diverged shortly after that. So they are also invertebrates. They only display the 4 key chordate traits during their larval stage, and then they lose them later. Okay, they're sessile organisms, sort of like the sponges and the corals, some of the cnidarians, and they're filter feeders. Okay, so have a pretty simple lifestyle. The ancestral chordate, or the common ancestor of all chordates, may have been somewhat similar in structure and morphology to a lancelet. Okay, so the vertebrates evolved from the early chordates about 500 million years ago. Okay, so slightly after the Cambrian explosion. So phylum Chordata was around during the Cambrian explosion. Vertebrates came slightly later. Okay, the early vertebrates had an advantage over the invertebrates because they were so much more efficient at capturing food and evading predators than their ancestors were. Okay, so the nervous system that was so well developed that we've talked about was probably important in allowing greater ease of movement and greater speed. And also some of the other developments that we'll talk about in a moment were also important in giving them an advantage. So the earliest vertebrates in the fossil record had no jaws. Okay, and these organisms have left two groups of modern day ancestors. Okay, these are the hagfishes and the lampreys. Okay, so these are cylindrical organisms that don't have jaws. Notice the lower picture of the lamprey, how it has sort of a suction cup shaped mouth. It's actually a parasitic organism, and it's got those little hooks that hooks it onto, usually a fish is the host. And I certainly wouldn't want to encounter a lamprey. Having one of those hook onto me and suck my blood doesn't sound very great. The hagfish that's above it is a scavenger, okay, but it also lacked jaws. The organisms with jaws are known as gnathostomes, okay, and they've diversified a great deal. So today there are a lot more gnathostomes or jawed vertebrates than there are jawless vertebrates. When this group first evolved, it was probably very successful due to the adaptations for predation. Okay, not only the jaws that define this group, but also the paired fins and tails made these efficient swimmers. And you can certainly see how having jaws would make it very easy to grab on to prey and hold it. Later, the gnathostomes diverged into three surviving lineages. Okay, the chondrichthyans, these are known as the cartilage fishes, including the sharks and the rays. The other group is known as the ray fin fishes. So these are most of the fish that we think of as fish. Like this lionfish shown here in the center picture. Notice how the fins have very slender bones that radiate from the body in a ray-shaped pattern. Okay, these bones are very delicate, and that's very important to note in the evolutionary history of fishes. Okay, so most of the fish that you would keep in an aquarium, a goldfish or an angelfish, most of the fish that we eat, like tuna and bass and perch and all of those fish, they're ray-finned fishes, okay, with the very delicate bones in the fin. And the last group is known as the lobe fins. Okay, the lobe fins, there are two remaining fish species known as lobe fins. These are coelacanths, like this primitive looking fish here on the right. But other groups included in the lobe fins include the mammals and the reptiles and the amphibians. Okay, so an ancestor somewhat similar to this coelacanth eventually gave rise to the land vertebrates. And it was the structure of their bones, which were there was a central bone coming out from the body, and it was a lot thicker and tougher, and it was a lot easier for that to evolve into a leg, whereas the ray-fin fishes didn't have a skeleton that was suitable to evolve into a walking leg that could be used on land. Okay, so let's look at this phylogeny here of the vertebrates. Okay, we have the common ancestor of all vertebrates that was some type of early chordate. And then the first group to diverge was the group that included both the hagfishes, and the lampreys. Okay, that group later diversified into those two groups. Okay, the other group then evolved the traits jaws and a mineralized skeleton. Okay, the jawless fishes, the hagfishes and lampreys, they do have a skeleton, but it's not as tough or as hard as the mineralized skeleton of these other groups. Okay, that group then diversified into several other groups, including the chondrichthyes. These are the cartilage fishes, like the sharks and rays and chimeras. Okay, now these don't currently have a mineralized skeleton. They only have a skeleton made out of cartilage. But interestingly, the fossil record shows that their ancestors did have a mineralized skeleton, and that they later lost that later in evolutionary development. Later, after the chondrichthyes branched off, we then have the evolution of lungs or lung-like derivatives. Okay, so even though fish don't have true lungs, they have a lung derivative called a swim bladder, okay, that eventually evolved into lungs in land-dwelling organisms. Okay, so we have the ray fin fishes splitting off from the lobe fin fishes next. Okay, and when lobe fins evolved, there was a big, strong bone that eventually led to the diversification of this group, with one lineage staying in the water and remaining very fish-like. Okay, that's the coelacanth. And the other lineage evolved for life on land. Okay, the lungfishes are sort of an in-between group. They typically live in water and behave kind of like a fish, but they have the ability to dry out, and they can live for many years in a block of dried mud. That's pretty amazing. But then the other group that diverged from the lobe fins entered land and became the tetrapods. Okay, tetra means four, and pod means foot. Okay, so these are four-footed organisms that walked on land. That includes the amphibians, the reptiles, and the mammals.